mud was frozen solid beneath his boots. Private Alexei Morozov, 19 years old, pulled his coat tighter against the black Soviet winter and listened. Not for orders, not for movement, for it, whatever it was. The veterans in his unit, the ones who had survived the summer fighting near Kharkov, had stopped trying to describe it. They simply said, "When you hear it coming, do not run. Running does nothing." He heard it first as a vibration in his teeth, then the horizon turned orange. Something crossed the sky above the Eastern Front that night in the winter of 1942 that no training manual had prepared any soldier for. It was not the whistle of artillery. It was not the drone of a bomber. It was a chorus. Dozens of voices layered into one sustained, rising howl, like the sky itself had torn open and was bleeding sound. Each rocket was unguided, relatively imprecise, and individually less powerful than a standard artillery shell, but the designers understood something that their enemies would only grasp after suffering the consequences, that the weapon's true power was not in any single rocket, it was in the salvo. On July 14, 1941, near the Belarusian railway junction of Orsha, Soviet Captain Ivan Flyorov commanded the first operational Katyusha battery, 7 launchers in total. German forces had seized the rail hub and were consolidating a supply operation there. Flyorov received his orders in the early afternoon and positioned his battery at distance. What happened next lasted less than 10 seconds. 112 rockets left their rails in a single continuous eruption of fire and noise and smoke. The rail junction at Orsha ceased to function. The German soldiers who survived were not injured in any conventional sense. They were undone. Several were found in the aftermath unable to speak. The machinery of civilian survival in wartime London was built entirely on the assumption that destruction announced itself first. Then, on September 8th, something happened that shattered that assumption permanently. A thunderclap with no preceding lightning struck the residential street of Staveley Road in Chiswick at 6:43 in the evening. 3 people died instantly. A crater 30 feet wide and 8 feet deep opened in the road, and for several confused minutes afterward, no one knew what had caused it. The V-2 descended from the edge of space faster than the speed of sound. You could not shelter from something that arrived before you knew it was coming. You could only listen to the sound of the rocket's passage rolling across the sky above the crater it had already made. The fuel of that ambition was provided by the labor of concentration camp prisoners in the underground Mittelwerk factory. More people died building the V-2 than were killed by it in combat. That calculation haunts the weapon's legacy to this day. Some weapons terrorize at distance, others make distance impossible. In the island warfare of the Pacific Theater, the United States Marine Corps encountered a defensive philosophy they had not fully anticipated, an enemy that had built its positions underground, that had constructed tunnel networks deep enough to survive naval bombardment. The conventional answer, grenades, explosive charges, rifle fire into openings, was deeply insufficient. The military answer was the M2 flamethrower, and it changed the moral landscape of the Pacific War in ways that soldiers struggled to process for the rest of their lives. Corporal James Buchanan described carrying the M2 as feeling like strapping a small son to your back. The device weighed 68 pounds fully loaded, compressed a mixture of gasoline thickened with napalm into a pressurized stream. Its range was no more than 50 meters. This is the detail that separated it from every other weapon in the American arsenal. To use it, you had to be close enough that the fire you sent forward returned heat against your own face. There is a temptation to reduce these weapons to engineering, to discuss yield and range as though numbers contain the full story. They do not. Every weapon here was an answer to how we break the other side before they break us. What these weapons shared was the capacity to reach into a soldier's mind and dismantle the psychological architecture that made combat survivable. Men who lived through a Katyusha barrage did not simply resume soldiering. Private Alexei Morozov returned to a village in 1946, worked as a schoolteacher for 30 years, and never once watched fireworks. Not because they frightened him, but because the sound of things burning in the sky brought him back to that trench. The weapons of World War II reshaped the interior geography of the men who lived inside them. That is the truest measure of a weapon's cost, the craters they leave in the people who survive.